Hello everyone, my name is Glenn Meron. During the 1980s and early 1990s, I had the opportunity to conduct research on the fishes of the Okavango Delta in the African country of Botswana. Some of the slides you are about to see are more than 25 years old, with some minor wear, but notwithstanding that, I trust you enjoy this story. The Okavango Delta is a giant oasis. The delta receives an inflow of water from rivers that drain southern Angola. As the Okavango River enters Botswana, it begins to overflow its banks onto a broad floodplain. Further south, below the village of Saranga, the river splits into three main branches and thousands of minor channels, with the Boro River flowing through the center of the delta. The Okavango can generally be broken up into perennial swamp and seasonal swamp. Within the northern area of the delta, the Okavango River flows throughout the year and can be as deep as 15 feet. Flanking the river is a dense growth of papyrus, a plant that is widespread in African swamps. There are numerous tributaries and lagoons throughout the Okavango. Each year, the Okavango Delta receives a pulse of energy in the form of an annual flood from rainfall in southern Angola. The annual inflow of water into the delta is approximately 11 billion tons. The floodwaters reach the northern Okavango in January and February, but due to the enormous size of the delta, the water does not reach the southernmost portions of the system until June or July. The flood connects the lagoons, swamps, and floodplains to the main river channel and creates a giant, slow-flowing swamp ecosystem. Enormous areas of aquatic vegetation thrive with the annual pulse of water as the entire system is revitalized. There are open water lagoons such as Garoki Lagoon. There are lagoons which are covered in water lilies such as Naraka Lagoon. The large river channels are lined with magnificent trees, while the smaller channels in the northern Okavango are lined with extensive overhanging vegetation. These rivers spread out into hundreds of smaller channels and lagoons. Two prominent geologic fault lines running northeast to southwest create a bowl-like depression between them, slowing the water and creating the enormous swamps that give the Okavango Delta its hand-like appearance. Channels in the southern area of the delta are slower flowing, and the aquatic vegetation takes on a different character. Many of the smaller channels are kept open by the activity of hippos, which are common throughout the delta. Many of the channels end at the base of the Okavango's hundreds of islands. Each year, tons and tons of papyrus and reeds float down the Okavango with the annual flood. This material can often form blockages in the channels, which are almost impenetrable to pass. The waters of the Okavango are crystal clear. The fisheries research program, which I am about to explain, was the brainchild of Professor Mike Bruton, sitting in the foreground. Mike was director of the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology in Grahamstown, South Africa, between 1982 and 1994. The institute was granted permission by the government of Botswana to carry out fisheries research and to assist the Botswana Fisheries Department with recommending ways to improve commercial fishing in the Okavango. This photo was taken in February 1983, and with Professor Bruton is Pete White, a former graduate student at the Institute. I became involved with the research while a graduate student at the University of Michigan. I had just completed my master's degree in fisheries, and my supervisor, Professor Logler, had been assisting Professor Bruton with developing the Department of Ichthyology and Fishery Science at Rhodes University, also in Grahamstown. Professor Logler told me about Professor Bruton and the Okavango Delta Fisheries Research project he wanted to develop. I contacted Professor Bruton, and he invited me to conduct my PhD research under his supervision. As I mentioned, each year the Okavango receives an annual flood from Angola. This is the Tamalakani River in the southern Okavango, taken at high water level when the flood waters arrive. This is the same area at low water level when the flood waters have receded. This is the Boro River at high water level, and again this is the Boro River at low water level. The Okavango Delta is internationally recognized for its large populations of wildlife. During my field research, I witnessed thousands of animals, including these Cape buffalo, elephant, lion, zebra, giraffe, and other wildlife. This was a typical scene traveling around doing our work. Talk about a morning traffic jam. The buffalo settled down but cautiously watched us go by. You don't want to get on the wrong side of these creatures. Elephants move throughout the Okavango. Often we would see them crossing the river channels to get to the other side. This particular one got a bit curious at our presence. One of my favorite animals are wild dogs, seen here casually walking past our truck. This particular animal was not in the least way fazed by our presence. Zebras were commonly seen, as were tsetse who feed on the lush floodplain grasses. A wide variety of bird life also flourishes throughout the Okavango. Various species of snakes, many carrying deadly venom, thrive in the Okavango. This python got caught up in the net, and we were able to free it without getting bitten. Thousands and thousands of insects call the Okavango home. Here is a typical view of a spider nest. Due to the nature of the fisheries research, crocodiles were a constant threat, and my staff and I encountered them almost daily. Crocodiles would often get tangled in the nets while trying to feed on the fish, and it required careful movements to untangle them. Hippopotamuses were another constant threat to contend with. Here I am with one of my field assistants in 1984. Hippos play an important role in maintaining open channels throughout the Okavango. You don't want to get in the way of these aquatic giants. My research entailed studying the fish community throughout the Okavango. It was the first time that such a comprehensive survey of this magnitude was undertaken. This is a tigerfish, which is a world-renowned freshwater fighting fish. This is a three-spot tilapia, which feeds on detritus and algae. This is one of my staff, J.L.B, holding a sharp-toothed catfish, which feeds on fish, frogs, small mammals, bird hatchlings, and whatever else it can get its mouth around. This is a pink happy. It feeds primarily on mussels. These are red-breast tilapia. The tilapia is a herbivore and found to feed almost exclusively on aquatic plant material. This is a very colorful species called the southern mouth brooder that keeps its fertilized eggs and developing young in its mouth away from harm's way. The southern mouth brooder feeds predominantly on bottom sediments and algal material. This is one of the many smaller catfish found in the Okavango. This odd-looking fish is called a Churchill and emits a small electrical current to communicate with other individuals. This fish feeds on aquatic insects. This is another weird-looking fish which feeds on aquatic insects. This is the spiny eel, which is secretive. It lives along the fringe of the main river channels and is rarely seen by people. It feeds on aquatic insects and plant material and is a very elusive fish to collect. This fish is called a climbing perch. There is an interesting story that goes with this fish. One day my staff and I were sorting through fish we had collected earlier that morning. One of the commercial fishermen came over to see what I was doing and pointed to this species and called it a buntu. The fisherman explained that this fish falls from the sky during periods of high rainfall. The fishermen reasoned that they fall from the sky because these fish appear on land far from the swamps during periods of heavy rainfall. I acknowledged his account and proceeded to show him the serrated gill cover, which is a special adaptation of this species that it is used like a pulley for traction over muddy and moist landscapes. Climbing perch literally crawl out of the swamps and across rain-soaked land, possibly in search of food. The climbing perch is able to breathe air directly from the atmosphere through a lung-like organ. I explained to the fishermen that the reason the climbing perch were away from the swamps was because they crawled out of the water, not that they came from the sky. He shook his head and chuckled. This is a labio, which is found only in specific habitat types in the Okavango. This is a photo of the Botswana fisheries officer John Rogers with the sunglasses and staff of the fisheries department in the Okavango in 1985. The Botswana Fisheries Department held training courses at several villages around the Okavango to teach commercial fishermen how to make gill nets and ways of preserving their catch to sell. Gill nets were the primary fishing technique used and capture fish by their gills as they try to swim through the net. I participated in several of these training courses, and they always attracted a lot of enthusiasm from the commercial fishermen. Commercial fishing is an important activity which provides jobs and revenue for people. Fish are cleaned on site and then placed on racks under the sun to dry. This commercial fisherman is proudly displaying his catch from a makoro, which is a traditional canoe-like boat carved from a tree. In addition to the commercial fishermen, thousands of people in the Okavango are subsistence fishermen, which means they catch fish to eat themselves. Hook and line are the main means of catching fish. This fisherman is sitting in a makoro along the fringe of the Okavango River. Another subsistence fisherman showing off his catch. Fishing was carried out on a daily basis, weather permitting. Subsistence fishermen also used traditional fish traps, like this one I came across on the Boro River. Fish moving downstream become trapped within the reeded enclosure. Often, small camps would be set up in the Okavango by families of fishermen who spend months catching fish, cutting reeds that are used not only for the fish traps, but also to construct huts, as well as gathering other food sources such as honey. These are cleaning the fish back at camp. These fillets are being smoked for preservation. Even the young boys get involved with fishing for the family meal. This young man was using a bow and arrow to catch fish. I was astonished on how accurate he was. Women were often seen using fishing baskets to scoop up fish and worked together to herd fish towards each other. These small tilapia will make a fine dinner. Recreational fishing is also widely pursued in the Okavango, and sport fishermen stay at the many lodges which promote fishing. This photo was taken in 1991. This photo, taken in 1990, was at the tsetse fishing camp. This tigerfish didn't get away. What a beautiful specimen. The tigerfish is one of the fiercest fighting freshwater fish species in the world. This was an interesting photo as it contrasts a group of recreational fishermen going out for tigerfish with two young men fishing in their traditional makoros for tilapia, which is the preferred food fish. The fisheries research work I conducted had two main objectives, which were to identify fish distribution, abundance, biology, and ecology throughout the Okavango, and how it relates to the annual flood cycle, and secondly, to use this information to improve the harvest of fish while maintaining the ecological integrity of the fish stocks. I set out with my 2 to 3 man field crew, and we sampled throughout the Okavango using a variety of fishing equipment. Over 70 species of fish were collected, and it is likely that more species are present. My crew worked with me throughout the research program. These are gill nets similar to the ones used by the commercial fishermen, and we were able to complete several experiments to compare our catch and effort with that of the commercial fishermen. Gill nets are appropriately called as they catch fish by their gills. In the net here is a tigerfish and a tilapia caught in Kugana Lagoon. We set nets in all the different habitat types found in the Okavango, including the smaller channels. This channel flows through an area known as Third Bridge in the Moremi Wildlife Reserve. These are some of the hardy catfish we caught at Maxagana pools in the Moremi Wildlife Reserve. I dissected several thousands of fish to determine what they feed on and when they reproduced. It was apparent that the annual floodwaters from Angola had a profound effect on the fish community and determined how their diet changed in relation to the flood cycle. This photo was taken in 1988. Those were the days. These are the gonads of a tilapia. We managed to determine the time of year that spawning in many of the Okavango's fishes occurred. Much of the research was published, and a list of references is available from the Inland Ecosystems website. During the course of my research, several scientists assisted with the collection of fish. These scientists would fly to the Okavango from the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology for an annual week-long collecting marathon. This photo was taken in 1985 at Dungu Lagoon. In this photo is a picture of the late Dr. Humphrey Greenwood, Centre in the Red Hat, a world-renowned ichthyologist from the British Museum in London. In the back of this photo is Professor Tom Hecht, who was the head of the Department of Ichthyology and Fishery Science at Rhodes University. Professor Hecht was also my PhD supervisor, along with Professor Bruton. On the left of this photo is Professor Bruton, and on the right is Dr. Paul Skelton, who is currently Managing Director of the South African Institute of Aquatic Biodiversity. This is formerly the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology. Both of them were collecting fish with a dip net along the Boro River in 1984. We used every fishing technique available to collect fish. This is the habitat of a fish called the striped robber, and we collected several at this site at Kakanika Lagoon in the Moremi Wildlife Reserve. We positioned the boat as a crocodile deterrent. Wishful thinking. This is me applying rotenone in a lagoon. Rotenone is made from the root of a South American plant and when mixed into the water stuns the fish who float to the surface. Rotenone was an effective method to collect fish in the dense aquatic vegetation areas. Here, field staff are collecting fish stunned by the rotenone. This is Dr. Paul Skelton dip netting in the Okavango River in 1983. This method of fishing is called longlining, which consists of a series of baited hooks hung along a 100-foot section of rope and was found to be another way of increasing the yield of fish to local fishermen while maintaining the integrity of the fish stock. Over 90% of the catch on long lines consisted of large catfish. Because of this selectivity, long lining is an ideal way to target the abundant catfish without affecting populations of other fish species. One of the main research findings was that the abundant silver catfish could be harvested to increase the yield of fish to local fishermen. The silver catfish was caught in smaller mesh gill nets. This large stock of fish was previously not being caught because of the use of only large mesh gill nets. After discussing the finding with John Rogers, the Fisheries Department implemented a program whereby commercial fishermen were encouraged to catch the silver catfish using smaller mesh gill nets. We also marked fish with a little plastic tag inserted below the dorsal fin. I recaptured many of the tagged fish, some often miles away from where they were initially tagged. Others were recaptured in the same area where they were tagged. This information helped understand the seasonal movements of several species of fish. After all the field data was collected, I entered the information on fish in various habitat types throughout the Okavango into a computer program. The program grouped the distribution and abundance of fish into select categories depending on whether a habitat was perennially or seasonally flooded, fast-flowing or slow-flowing, and a pattern was seen in the distribution of the fish. The northern perennial waterways were characterized by a greater variety of fish species, many of which reach a large size, such as the tigerfish and catfish. In contrast, the southern seasonal waterways were characterized by a lower variety of fish species, and their overall body size was smaller. A poster depicting many of the fishes of the Okavango and their preferred habitat types was produced by the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology in 1989 and widely circulated throughout the Okavango. Many went to the area schools and clinics. This is a photo of the boat I used for several years in the Okavango. J.L.B., one of my staff, is refueling the gas tanks at a remote location where we hid gasoline. A large part of the research work was funded by the World Wildlife Fund, and we proudly displayed the panda bear logo. At times, getting to the sampling sites was not easy. River channels could be blocked by millions of papyrus stalks brought down the river during the floods. Unfortunately, you could never anticipate these barriers being there and either have to turn around or pull the boat and equipment over the top of them. We never did turn around and always managed to pull the boat over the top of the blockage. This could, however, take all day. During the early years of the research, this was the forward control Land Rover I used as a home, lab, and it was an all-around workhorse. On some occasions, we used a Toyota 4x4. This photo shows us loading the truck and boat onto a ferry at the village of Mohembo to cross the Okavango River. This photo was taken in 1985. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, this was our primary research vehicle. It was equipped with long-range fuel tanks, dual spare tires, heavy-duty bush guard, and a custom steel rack for transporting our equipment. Other times it was a matter of poling through the shallow floodplain habitats to reach the sampling sites. At times we had to pull the canoe across islands to get to the other side. Some of the most exciting ways to get equipment into the heart of the Okavango was by helicopter. This is a picture taken in 1989 at Goroki Lagoon. Knowing basic mechanics is important, as you never know when an equipment failure will occur. Often we were long distances away from any help. For this repair, I had to bypass the fuel filter until we got back to the town of Mound, where more permanent repairs could be made. Here I am replacing a torn fan belt in the middle of the Moremi Wildlife Reserve. The next series of slides depict one of the most fascinating ecological events which occurs in the Okavango, and that is the annual catfish run. This predator-prey interaction entails pack hunting by catfish on smaller fish species. The catfish runs take place largely in the Okavango's panhandle, between the villages of Shikawi in the north and Saranga in the south. The runs occur usually between September and December of each year. The presence of large flocks of fish-eating birds is a sure sign that catfish are in the area. Hundreds of birds line the fringe of the river. These birds feed on disoriented fish swimming along the fringes of the river channels. The noise of the birds yakking away is an unforgettable sound. These are the catfish feeding amongst the papyrus fringe of the mainstream channel. There is a continual slapping and slurping noise from the large catfish, literally sucking in the smaller fish. Once we located a catfish run, it was possible to follow it on a daily basis and to determine the direction of travel and distance covered. My observations indicated that the overall movement was upstream at a speed of 3 to 4 kilometers per day. The catfish runs could be up to a half a mile long and consist of thousands and thousands of catfish. This is a close-up of the mouth of a catfish. They literally suck in the small prey fishes. The catfish we analyzed during the runs were always given to the local people. This is me kneeling and analyzing the catch as local people look on in 1986. What I found was that the catfish were feeding largely on two small species of fish called the bulldog and Churchill. This catfish had 8 bulldog fish in its stomach. I hypothesized that because bulldogs and Churchills generate a weak electrical signal, catfish are able to detect the signal through their whiskers, thus enabling them to selectively home in on these prey. This was the first time the mystery of the catfish runs was unfolded. The act of catfish pack hunting and preying on these smaller fish appears to be a unique feeding specialization in the Okavango. Another fascinating discovery came when Professor Mike Bruton and I discovered saucer plate-sized clumps of foam bubbles in the fringes of a channel. These were the foam nest of the African pike, a voracious predator but a gentle parent that protects their offspring. These are the foam nests that are made by the adult pike. While observing the foam nests, we discovered tiny baby pike clinging to the bottom of the foam. The adult pike patrolled the area in the vicinity of the nest and added foam as necessary to the nest. The foam is secreted through 2 pairs of dermal flaps on the upper and lower jaw of pike. Here are more foam nests that my staff would call the spit of God. The pike babies literally cling to the bottom of the nest by a cement gland located on their head and feed on their yolk sacs. We managed to collect several babies and watch them develop. The young pike remained by the nest for approximately 2 to 3 weeks before swimming away on their own to establish territories. A scientific paper prepared by myself, Professor Bruton, and student Kathy Holden was published in 1987. This is a series of slides from Lake Ngami in the southwestern corner of the Okavango system. This lake undergoes enormous fluctuations in water level depending on the magnitude of the annual flood waters and whether they reach this lake. This photo was taken in 1980 during a Rhodes University expedition to the lake. Operating the boat is Mr. Pete Smith, who was employed by the Botswana Department of Water Affairs and who provided tremendous assistance to the fisheries program. This is a picture of the lake in December 1982 during a period when Angola and Botswana were experiencing severe drought conditions. The annual floodwaters never made it to the lake and it was drying up. Lake Ngami is also home to thousands of birds, which during years of drought migrate to more suitable habitat conditions. This boat was left high and dry as the lake receded. This is Dr. Paul Skelton observing hundreds and hundreds of catfish trapped in the drying lake bed. This fisheries resource was harvested by the fishermen. These boys also lent a hand with netting the remaining catfish. It was relatively easy to catch the catfish due to their concentrated situation. The catfish were quickly cleaned by the fishermen and then placed on racks under the sun to dry, and they provided an important protein resource for the people. Fires are a natural phenomenon in the Okavango, but often fires are set by people to clear areas for crops or cattle grazing. This was a large-scale fire I observed in 1989 near the village of Sipopa. As we got closer to the fire, the flames were enormous. We could feel the intense heat of the fire as the papyrus went up in flames. Here I am standing on shore to witness this event. I cautiously went over to the burned area, and you could see what was about to happen to the vegetation as the fire spread. Large-scale burning along the Okavango has implications for fish. The ash from the fire robs the water of essential oxygen that fish breathe and can cause fish kills downstream of burnt areas. Other fires in the Okavango are naturally occurring. This fire was started by lightning the previous day and burnt for several days. This is a photo of Naraka Lagoon in 1987. At times, our remote satellite camps, where I used to hide supplies and fishing equipment, were affected by fire. This is a photo of Professor Mike Bruton at Garoki Lagoon in 1989. Professor Bruton was visiting me at the time and participating in one of the field trips. I had mentioned to Professor Bruton before we left the town of Mound by helicopter that my field assistants and I had put a considerable amount of effort into making this a well-equipped satellite field camp. We were horrified to find, however, when we reached the site, that a fire had swept through the area and all the equipment, including the tents, ropes, boxes, had been incinerated. We nevertheless continued the sampling effort, sleeping outside in the ashes and making do as best as we could. Professor Bruton wrote an anecdotal account of this particular trip, which is available from this webpage. This is a picture of a tsetse fly. The tsetse fly transmits a deadly parasite that causes sleeping sickness in humans, known as trypanosomiasis. It also causes a debilitating disease in cattle called nagana. Numerous attempts have been made on the African continent to eradicate this fly. During the 1980s and early 1990s, large-scale aerial spraying of the Okavango using insecticides was conducted. The advantages of aerial spraying of insecticides included rapid mortality of tsetse flies and the ability to control large areas of the Okavango more effectively. The disadvantage of aerial spraying is that it entailed blanket application of insecticides in the Okavango, which at times led to problems with fish mortality. This is one of the planes used for aerial spraying. Typically, two identical planes were used. Aerial spraying was conducted during the evening hours when atmospheric inversions exist above the Okavango and allows the insecticide to settle through the trees and onto the ground. These planes contained a large tank in the rear where the insecticide was held. There are spraying apparatuses on the wings of the plane which disperse the insecticide over the Okavango. In 1988, Dr. Bowles, the former Chief Tsetse Fly Control Officer in Mound, mentioned to me that aerial spraying for tsetse fly control would be required in the Okavango between 1989 and 1991. He asked me if I could provide fisheries monitoring during the program and make recommendations for avoiding impacts to fish. This is Dr. Bowles on the left and me on the right discussing the planned aerial spraying program. I set up a research camp in the middle of the Okavango close to Chiefs Island, and aerial spraying commenced in August 1989. It was completed by November. The tsetse flies reside in the canopy of the trees, but due to the mosaic of river channels, floodplains, and lagoons in the Okavango, water bodies were also sprayed. My staff and I observed fish mortality in shallow floodplain habitats where many fish are found. Deeper river channels and large lagoons exhibited no fish mortality. After the completion of the 1989 spraying campaign, I suggested to Dr. Bowles that it would be environmentally safer to begin aerial spraying during the cooler months when fish are not physiologically active. Dr. Bowles agreed to change the 1990 spraying season to occur during the Okavango's cooler months, typically May through July, to minimize impacts to fish. Getting around the Okavango during the spraying cycles often required the use of a helicopter to get me and my staff into remote areas where we needed to assess the impacts to fish. We surveyed thousands of water bodies during the course of the 3-year spraying program. Other times we sampled the Okavango using our Makoro. This was a typical camp setting for me and my staff during the survey period. We had to be highly mobile and my staff and I could pack up our camp in a day and follow the planes to their next destination over the Okavango. In 1990, we set up a satellite camp at Takalamatsaudi. Early into the 1990 spraying season, there was still evidence of some fish affected by the insecticide, although the number and type of fish affected was less than in 1989. I attributed the reduced mortality to moving the aerial spraying program forward to the cooler winter months. Here, 2 of my field staff are collecting some of the few fish affected. However, as the spraying program continued over the next couple of months, aeroplane navigational errors resulted in an overdosing of insecticide, leading to a large number of fish affected. This particular fish kill resulted in Dr. Bowles sending the manufacturers of the insecticide as well as the pilots to inspect the impact that the insecticide had on the fish population. On board this helicopter are representatives of the insecticide manufacturer as well as the spraying pilots after monitoring the fish kill observed in the previous slide. This photo was taken at Takalamatsaudi in 1990. Not only were fish affected, but we were also very concerned at the impact the insecticide was having on other non-target organisms such as butterflies and other flying insects that were impacted after aerial spraying campaigns. After discussions with Dr. Bowles, it was decided to test a wide range of insecticides in an effort to find an insecticide which achieved the goal of tsetse control while minimizing the impact on fish and other non-target organisms. In 1990, we began an exhaustive field and laboratory-based program testing several insecticide formulations. This photo shows Professor Bruton and graduate student Kathy Holden testing insecticides at Guma Lagoon. Dr. Bowles and I also set up a series of fish tanks in his laboratory in Mound where additional tests were conducted on various insecticides. This is Professor Bruton applying an insecticide to a shallow floodplain area in 1990. These experiments demonstrated that mortality to fish occurred under certain environmental conditions, especially in shallow water, combined with warmer water temperatures and lowered dissolved oxygen levels. In early 1991, an insecticide not previously used in the Okavango was identified as having maximum impact on tsetse flies and minimal impact on fish. Based on the research results, the government of Botswana selected for the first time to spray ultra-low volumes of deltamethrin for tsetse fly control in 1991. In May 1991, my field staff and I set up a base camp at Maxagana Pools in the Moremi Wildlife Reserve. I anxiously wanted to see how the deltamethrin insecticide would perform under actual aerial spraying conditions for tsetse fly control and environmental sensitivity. No fish mortality was recorded, and mortality to tsetse flies was excellent based on conversations I had with tsetse fly control staff monitoring the new insecticide's effectiveness. Dr. Bowles was able to join me and my field staff for several days during one of the aerial spraying cycles. I was pleased that Dr. Bowles could personally witness the field results on the use of deltamethrin. Throughout the course of the 1991 spraying season, there was no noted gross effect on the environment. During the course of the 1991 spraying program, we would set enormous fires at night when the spraying occurred to notify the pilots that we were in the area assessing the spraying activities. An upgraded satellite navigational system was also installed in the 2 airplanes in 1991, which significantly improved navigational accuracy over the Okavango. The pilots would dip their planes when they saw our fire. The 1991 spraying program was an enormous success. A combination of laboratory and field work, coupled with public awareness, resulted in changes in the tsetse fly control program implemented by the Botswana authorities. The absence of fish kills or gross environmental damage in 1991 was due to a combination of an appropriate insecticide and application technique which took into account the unique circumstances of the Okavango. The Okavango contains a rich variety of natural aquatic vegetation. However, Salvinia molesta, or Kariba weed, is an alien aquatic plant that was brought to Africa from South America in the 1900s. This plant has now spread throughout vast areas of the continent, clogging waterways and necessitating numerous control programs at considerable cost to many governments. In northern Botswana, Salvinia has occurred for over 50 years along the Kwando and Chobe river systems. In the absence of any natural predators, Salvinia spreads rapidly. It is a floating plant that is able to double itself in size within a month and form huge mats. The problem with the establishment of Salvinia is that it leads to the exclusion of sunlight within rivers and lakes, thereby reducing one of nature's fundamental ecological processes known as photosynthesis. This photo was taken in the Kwando River in 1986 and shows how the Salvinia forms mats on the surface of the water. I was invited on this trip by Mr. Pete Smith of the Department of Water Affairs, who was leading the efforts to combat Salvinia infestations. Fish life is also affected, and the number and kinds of fish is much lower in Salvinia-infected water bodies. The first outbreak of Salvinia in the Okavango Delta appeared in the Moremi Wildlife Reserve in 1985. Due to the tremendous efforts of Pete Smith, the infestation was fenced off and the masses of Salvinia were collected and burnt. This close-up of Salvinia mats demonstrates how this plant can rapidly expand its range through an aggressive root system. In 1989, I informed Pete Smith that we had found Salvinia at a previously unknown site in the Okavango. While the Salvinia had not reached the stage where it covered the entire water surface, it was a high priority for Pete to eradicate. Pete then released hundreds of a small insect called a weevil to control the infestation. The weevils feed solely on Salvinia plants. This use of the weevil was a major milestone in the control and eradication of Salvinia in the Okavango as well as many other areas of Africa. The weevil's diet is so specific that they pose no threat to any indigenous plants or animals. Between 1984 and 1985, Dr. Paul Skelton and I had the opportunity to conduct 3 intensive fish surveys on the Okavango River as it flows through the country of Namibia. We began our survey work at the town of Rundu and continued eastward to the Botswana border. The research was part of the environmental impact assessment to determine the potential effects of water withdrawal from the Okavango River. The project is called the Eastern National Water Carrier. At the time, a small percentage of water was already being diverted from the river. This is a section of the water carrier under construction in 1984. This was a completed section of the canal taken in 1985. I am standing in the foreground on the right. This is the water intake tower located in the Okavango River at Rundu. What is particularly evident in this photo is the difference between the tower's low water mark and high water mark. The Okavango River can rise in excess of 10 feet every year depending on the magnitude of the flood flowing from Angola. This area along the Okavango River is called Popa Rapids. During the survey work Paul and I conducted, we were informed that plans to build a hydroelectric dam along this stretch of river to provide the ever-growing population of Namibia with power was being considered. The water flowing through this section of river has enormous energy potential, though the consequences of damming the river in Namibia could have ramifications for water flowing into the Okavango Delta in Botswana. We collected several species of fish at Popa Rapids, many of which were not found anywhere else in the system. This is a photo of Shirley Roberts from the Namibian Department of Water Affairs, who assisted us with the survey work. I hope you enjoyed the above presentation. While brief in certain sections, it may lead many of you to read more about the wonders of the great Okavango ecosystem. The fishes of the Okavango Delta are a valuable natural resource for the people of Botswana. By monitoring the fishes, scientists can provide valuable information for the region's planners and decision makers as to the potential effects to the aquatic environment from various actions. One thing I took home with me when I left the Okavango in 1991 was the importance of maintaining this ecosystem for the future. Should anyone want to read further on the fisheries research work conducted in the Okavango, I have put together a series of short stories on the Delta called Rod de Tapi Stories from the Okavango. This can be downloaded from the Inland Ecosystems web page as well. If anyone has any comments on Okavango fish ecology, please don't hesitate to email me at the contact provided on the web page. Goodbye, and I hope some of you have the opportunity to visit this magnificent area.